Welcome to All In, a straight-shooting, science-based podcast about periods, fertility, and nurturing health outside of unrealistic beauty expectations. We will mostly, but not exclusively, focus on hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA, a component of relative energy deficiency in sport, formerly known as the female athlete triad.
I'm Dr. Nicola Sykes, scientist and author of the book No Period, Now What? I specialize in helping people understand how their eating, exercise, and lifestyle habits are keeping them from hormonal health and their best life. My work focuses on regaining periods, improving fertility, and breaking free of the rules underlying diet culture.
My name is Florence Gillet. I'm a certified eating psychology coach, a former HA patient, and an advocate of health at every size and body neutrality. I help people let go of their obsession with size and appearance to regain self-confidence, finally appreciate their bodies, and live an overall fuller, more joyful life.
Every 2 weeks, the All In podcast brings you real recovery stories, expert insights, and new scientific research on HA, hormonal health, and fertility, with an unmissable touch of body respect and women's empowerment.
Just a reminder that this podcast represents the opinions of the hosts and their guests. This content should not be taken as medical advice. It's for informational purposes only. And because each person is unique, please consult your primary care practitioner for any medical questions. Music by the Andy Shulman Band, available on Spotify.
Good morning, everybody, and we would really like to welcome Dr. Asher Larmy to the All In podcast today. Asher, they, is a transmasculine, weight-inclusive GP and leading expert in weight stigma. He is a fat activist and the founder of the No Way campaign. With over 2 decades of medical experience and a lifelong journey as a fat person, Asher is combating weight stigma and promoting weight-inclusive care as a self-styled fat doctor. We're so honored to have you on today, Asher. Could you tell us a little bit more about your story and what led you to want to educate and combat weight stigma, and even more so as a GP, which for folks in the US is a general practitioner. I think that's a more common term in the UK than it is here. So
I didn't think folks in the US knew what a general practitioner was, but it's apparently lots of people have general practitioners, but primary care physician or whatever you want to call me.
Yes, exactly.
Jack of all trades, master of none, one of those. I graduated medical school in 2003. That is now over 20 years ago. I hit that milestone. And obviously I was introduced into the, weight-centered paradigm. Weight-centered, weight-focused paradigm. That's the one. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, that was my life. I didn't know any better. And I spent the majority of my working life practicing under that illusion. And then 2020 hit. There was a pandemic, in case any of you have forgotten. I turned 40 in May of 2020. And I don't know, it was a series of life events that got me to a place where I decided I was going to try another diet. And this was going to be the one. This was going to be the one that stuck. I've done this many, many, many times. I don't know why I deluded myself into thinking, well, I do know why. But, I deluded myself into thinking this was the one. I lost a significant amount of weight in a very short period of time. I thought I was doing it to protect myself from COVID. And once again, I hit a wall. My mental health went down the toilet. Everything went wrong. I stopped losing weight, the usual stuff. Yeah. And I got to that stage where I just thought, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. I don't know. Maybe it was turning 40 that helped, that I just thought, no, I'm done. This is the end. And so I kind of probably started off by Googling what happens if I don't want to go on a diet anymore, that kind of thing. I was introduced to the anti-diets, health at every size space, if you want. Started reading books, reading articles, listening to podcasts and going, wait, what? Someone ever told me this before? Are you kidding me? Then I started doing the research because I am autistic. I need to do the work. I need to understand. I can't just accept things at face value. So I started doing a lot of reading and a lot of researching. And I realized, turns out weight loss actually doesn't improve your health. In fact, looks like it actually makes your health worse. And I tried to reconcile that with being a doctor. And then I started to learn about weight stigma. I didn't really understand what that was. It had never been explained to me. Isn't that crazy? I got to 41 years old before someone said, have you ever heard of the term weight stigma? I hadn't. And then as I started to learn about it, I felt a sort of like a compulsion, it wasn't even an option for me. I had to do something. I couldn't stay silent about this. And actually the plan was just to find other people that were talking about it, find other doctors and just say, hey, How can I support you?
Mm-hmm.
So I went looking for them and I couldn't find them. They were nowhere. And I'm not saying I'm the only weight neutral doctor out there. I'm not saying I'm the only doctor that campaigns against weight stigma, but there wasn't like this huge kind of body of people. There wasn't an organization I could join. So I was like, well, looks like I'm on my own. So I started talking about it. And the more I talked about it, the more I realized how important it was, the more I researched. And it's kind of now become the focus of my, I'm not going to say my life, but certainly my career and my passion and what I want to do, get up and do every morning. And it's kind of what I'm doing now.
That's wonderful. I think it's so interesting. Do you have a blog post or something where you've sort of collated the research that you found that really supported your new way of thinking?
You know, first of all, I keep diving in more and more and more, and I find more and more stuff. There was a couple of articles that I read. There's a famous article by Tracy Mann and the group. I don't want to just say it was Tracy Mann because that's not fair. There were other people involved as well. It's from 2007, and I think it's entitled Medicare's search for something to do with obesity. I can't remember, but it has the terms Medicare and obesity in it, and it's a really important narrative review. That sort of, for me, was the foundational paper that I read and went, whoa, that like blew me away. And then I started reading from there. I've read a lot on weight stigma, and there are a few papers. There's one by Sean Phelan from 2015, which I really recommend people read, which is about weight stigma. And I sort of started from there. There are lots of people who talk about it, but really for me, Regan Chastain is like my, I don't know, I think she hates it when I call her this, but she's my mentor. I live for everything she says. To me, every word that comes out of her mouth is just like gold dust. So I'm subscribed to her newsletter, and I am fortunate enough to have sort of become friends with Regan. And so I get to talk to her sometimes face to face, well, virtually. And I've learned a lot from her. She has a really great Substack, which I cannot praise enough. And if you want to learn, that's the place to go to learn, I think.
So we'll link to all of those papers and resources in the show notes.
Yeah.
And
we were very lucky to also have Regan Chastain on our podcast. And she also blows my mind. I'm one of her subscribers for years now. And now, for example, anytime a new drug comes onto the market or something like that, I feel like she's helping me actually convey the message in a proper way as well, because she has that research background that I don't have. I can't read those papers and be critical about them. But also she's incredibly funny and witty, and she's really a lovely person. Yeah, absolutely.
She really is. So what you see is what you get. She's very genuine. And actually, she taught me to critically appraise papers. I learned how to read a journal article. I went to medical school. I learned under all sorts of professors. Yada, yada, yada. Doesn't matter. It was only when I met Regan, and really she just explains things in a way that just makes sense. And so now I'm able to take that kind of knowledge which came from her and apply it to the papers that I'm reading on any particular subject. Yeah, we do something called the Hayes Health Sheets. They're available online to anyone, and they're basically health sheets for specific medical conditions. And Regan does like 80% of the work. I do 20% of the work, and somehow I get credited, which is really not fair. But yeah, it's been a pleasure to be part of that with her as well. It's become the Regan Appreciation Society all of a sudden.
Fan club.
Yeah.
I find that a lot of the people that discover they have hypothalamic amenorrhea or REDS, they sometimes are not aware of weight stigma and what it means.
Yeah.
And we're interested for you to tell us a little bit more about not only what it is, because the name alludes to it, but why should it be really central to any discussion when it comes to disordered eating or eating disorders?
It's a very good question. So and I think it's quite difficult to define weight stigma. I mean, stigma, we all know that there are certain groups of people that society in general has very negative associations, beliefs, judgments, stereotypes about. And higher weight people, fat people, I use the word fat as a very neutral descriptor, but higher weight individuals are one of those groups. And, you know, you can say that about disabled people, autistic people, trans people, black people. I mean, we all know these things. There are negative assumptions that come with living in a society that unfortunately is set up to oppress certain groups of people. So stigma is the real life experience of that. It's not the hypothetical stuff. It's how it's impacting me in my day-to-day. So for example, I'm less likely to get a job when I go to an interview because of the size of my body. And that's not fair. But that
Yeah.
impacts me massively, right? Because it's going to impact my income. It's going to impact also my self-esteem. It's going to impact what school my children go to. It's going to impact where I live. It's going to impact a lot of stuff just because I'm not going to get a job, because the future employer will look at me and say, no, they're fat, and they will have assumptions and beliefs about me. This is all very much backed up by science. Obviously, I am particularly interested not in employment, but in medical weight stigma, because I'm interested in how weight stigma impacts the medical consultation or healthcare or whatever you want to call it. And I think there's two really important ways this happens. The first is the way that it impacts doctors. So doctors make assumptions and judgments about certain people based on their weight. And actually, this goes both ways. They make assumptions about thin people and they make assumptions about fat people. And making assumptions about anyone is wrong because that will lead to a misdiagnosis in either group. And I've seen it work both ways. I remember distinctly having a patient once contact me after he'd had a stroke. He was in his 40s. He must have been about my age now. It was a few years ago. And he said, how could I have had a stroke? I'm 45. I'm thin. I run every day. It's not possible. And I said, yeah, but it turns out you had high blood pressure, you had high cholesterol, but we didn't know because we looked at you and we assumed healthy young man. And so it works both ways. But unfortunately, of course, it's always the case that fat people, higher weight people, experience that stigma to a greater degree. So missed diagnosis, doctors not noticing that somebody has lost weight unintentionally, and that's actually really serious. People not diagnosing eating disorders, because you can't be fat and have an eating disorder, you must be thin, right? Like that's what a lot of doctors think. Doctors not starting treatment, to the point that we have evidence that people are dying because doctors are delaying treatment. And so it impacts the doctor, but it also impacts the patient. So when you experience stigma, it impacts your ability to trust your doctor. Why would you trust your doctor if they're stigmatizing you? Communicate openly. So we tend to lie or not tell them everything because we're afraid of the consequences. So that's dangerous. It's harder for us to adhere to advice because we can't trust and we can't communicate. And also the advice is often very stigmatizing, and often the advice is go out and lose weight, exercise more, eat less, and that's not helpful. And perhaps most importantly, most fat people will avoid doctors at all costs because they are very traumatizing experiences to be around a doctor. And even if you haven't experienced the trauma personally, just being part of the group is enough to fear the doctor, because I know what doctors think about fat people, so they're going to think that about me. And so it's a very important conversation. And I think when it comes to eating disorders, disordered eating, I like to think of them both together. But, there is the problem that higher weight individuals with these conditions are often just missed altogether. If they aren't missed, they're not treated properly. Doctors will spend less time with them. Doctors will be less concerned about them. Doctors are less likely to admit them, to refer them for specialist care, etc., etc. But also, chances are, if you're a fat person with an eating disorder, you probably aren't going to seek medical care because you're too afraid to. And that, for me, is the most worrying thing. Like, I don't want you sitting at home unwell, whether it's mentally, emotionally, physically, because you're afraid to go to a doctor. Like, that, to me, is where we must act. We must act. We have to act to educate doctors, but also just to make the doctor's office a safe space again, because it should be a safe space, for goodness sake. Of all the places, a doctor's office should be a safe space, but it's not.
Absolutely.
Not if
Absolutely.
if you look like me.
And I'm interested just to add something, because people that will listen to us, they may not be in a larger body. They may be in a quote unquote normal weight. But we know that a lot of them may be dismissed as in, you cannot possibly have lost your periods because you're under fueling and over exercising because you are a normal weight, quote unquote. So I want to insist on the fact that obviously that stigma is worse the bigger you get and the more marginalized you are on different levels. Like you said, I want to say that for a lot of the women that we support, they will have seen a doctor that has literally looked at their weight or their appearance and decided you could not possibly be in that situation because you look quote unquote normal. Is that also with stigma? Do you agree with me?
I think that if nothing else, it's negligence. It's bad doctoring. One has nothing to do with the other, is what I want to say. Whatever
Yeah.
size you are, and it's a fact. We know that if you're not eating enough and you're exercising too much and you're in an energy deficit, we know that one of the first things is going to be affected is gonadotrophin releasing hormone, and that is going to impact your estrogen, your ovaries, your estrogen, progesterone, and so for a doctor to then go, but no, I've looked at you and I've decided that that's not possible. That, to me, is ridiculous. It's obvious. If you're not eating enough and you're exercising too much and you're no longer getting your periods, 1 + 1 in this case really does equal 2. And it makes me so angry that we make these judgments based on what we're seeing. And the key here is that we really, truly believe that what you eat and how much exercise you do determines what you look like. And that is a genuine misunderstanding that we simply do not understand the way that the body works. And it's not like this evidence isn't out there. This evidence has existed for many years, for decades even. It's just not something that is common knowledge, that actually you could be starving yourself, literally, and you could be in grave danger, and your heart could be struggling, and your kidneys could be struggling, and you could stop ovulating, be whatever size. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
You don't have to be thin. And I think it's only, 6% of people are technically underweight? Only 6%. What the other 94% we're missing just because we use our eyes and make a judgment that we have no business doing. Beyond stigma, that's just negligence. And there's no excuse for this. Just isn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is no defense.
I always like to say, your weight is not part of the diagnostic criteria. Like, if you look at the papers that describe hypothalamic amenorrhea or PCOS or primary ovarian insufficiency, none of them have weight as a criterion. I mean, it's blood work, it's ultrasound. There are lots of other diagnostic techniques that can be used. Weight is not one of them.
Yeah. And also, I often find that doctors nowadays, they look at a screen and a set of test results and they make a diagnosis based on that. And actually, what I learned in medical school was you make the diagnosis based on a history. In fact, I remember learning very early on, I had this fantastic dermatologist who used to do this thing with junior doctors. And she would say, you don't get to look at the rash. You need to make the diagnosis before you look. And it would be her challenge to us. I want you to make the diagnosis based on the history, not by looking at the rash. Because if you look, you'll see something that will confirm bias. I need the diagnosis before. And she would force us to make a diagnosis before actually looking at the rash. And I found that to be so helpful. It taught me that the clue is in the history. And I think one of the problems is that doctors will look at someone and then they will say, tell me about how much you're eating, or what's your diet like, or how much you exercise. And they will not believe what they're being told. Of course, sometimes, as I said, we lie. But if we're being forthcoming and telling the truth, no, actually, I am doing this or I'm doing that, and a doctor says, I don't believe you, then again, I can make that diagnosis prior to any blood test. I will do the blood test to confirm my diagnosis, to support even. And even if the blood tests come back normal, I'll still be more willing to bet on my clinical skills than I am on a blood test alone. For the most part, of course, it's not for every condition. But that is so important. And again, so there's no excuse. We were taught to take a history first. And if you can't do that, and if you don't believe your patients, then again, there's a you problem. As a doctor problem, this is not a patient problem, and it needs to be addressed immediately because unfortunately doctors are getting away with it. And eating disorders is one of the areas I noticed that they get away with it a lot. A lot of things go unchecked.
So what do you think needs to happen for the eating disorder diagnosis and treatment to stop being so weight-centric?
Oh gosh, I'm not the expert in this. There are people who are better placed to give their advice. And I think, I genuinely believe we just need to remove weight from the equation, as we need to for all medical conditions. An eating disorder is obvious irrespective of your weight. There are a set of diagnostic criteria, there are questions that need to be asked. And like you would do with like a double-blind randomized controlled trial, we don't see it. It's not there. Yep. And therefore, I make my decision based solely on the history. And also, I believe my patients, which I think that's also a lost art. And I don't make assumptions about my patients because unfortunately, certainly people in higher weight bodies will often, doctors won't even ask about exercise or diet. They'll just assume that they're eating too much of this and not eating enough of that. So, that's why I talk about weight neutral care. You can be an amazing doctor. In fact, I would argue you're a better doctor if you just don't even ever bother to look at weight. And there are occasions when I do For example, if there's somebody who I'm really concerned about fluid balance, and so I'm measuring their weight because I'm worried about their fluids, there'll be times when I have to calculate the dose of a particular drug and I need your weight to work that out. So there are times when a weight is necessary, but they're few and far between. Otherwise, it's just not part of my day-to-day, and I am perfectly capable of making any diagnosis, and I would argue better placed to make that diagnosis because I'm not allowing these stereotypes, these prejudgments to influence me.
Yeah,
so just take weight out of the equation. That's so easy as well. Just stop doing it.
Yeah. So that discussion around weight bias, weight discrimination is really, really vital, especially in the medical world. I completely agree with you, and I know Nicola does too. But it seems to be so controversial, right? I'm sure you felt that way many, many times, that you're just one voice against like the medical establishment. And I'm just curious, what did you find out as a practitioner, about this medical establishment really refusing the idea of there is a problem with this bias?
First of all, I want to point out that the medical establishment refuses to accept that there is a problem with any form of bias. Okay? Now, we pay lip service to certain forms of bias. For example, the medical establishment will say, oh, racial bias, absolutely wrong. We should be doing something about it. We say it, but we don't do anything about it. There is absolutely no effort at all whatsoever to address racial bias in any kind of real sort of practical and like useful way. It's just lip service. There's a box ticking exercise that we do to look good. And I think this is the issue across the board. I would argue that doctors are some of the most ableist people I've ever met in my life. Not just doctors, nurses as well. I have never heard people speak so badly about disabled people as I have within the medical profession. They are, in my opinion, the worst. So weight stigma, I don't think, is this isolated issue where it's like, everything else is addressed, like doctors deal with all of these problems. Doctors are so transphobic. You have no idea what happened to me from my own colleagues when I came out as transgender. I mean, it was horrendous. I could not work in that practice anymore because I just couldn't be around these people. They just couldn't handle it. And of course, there was lip service, but it didn't matter. The way they behaved towards me, we're terrible. We're not great people. I mean, as a group of people, we are extremely prejudiced because we are very privileged. And I think when you are in a very privileged position, oftentimes you lose sight of injustice in the world. And so there is no desire to do anything about weight stigma. The thing that I think is uniquely problematic when it comes to weight stigma is that it pays good money to stigmatize people because of their weight. And that's where we run into trouble, because doctors are being paid to force weight loss onto their patients, to talk about weight loss with their patients, to promote weight loss with their patients. And if you have disordered eating or an eating disorder, and really it doesn't matter what weight you are, that is an actual threat to your well-being, right? The fact that doctors are paid to push weight loss, because, okay, if you're in a what I would call a straight-sized body, or if you have an acceptable weight, then doctors are less likely to push it. But if you're in recovery, there is the chance that you're actually going to recover into a larger body. And that's a real threat for people. I know a lot of people who are trying to recover from eating disorders, but are afraid. But if I recover, maybe I won't be thin anymore, and then I will experience this prejudice. But doctors are being paid to push weight loss, and they are being paid to push weight loss in people who have eating disorders, even though we know that weight loss surgery and weight loss injections are contraindicated in people with a history of eating disorders. Contraindicated. They're not safe. They really aren't. And we know this, and even the manufacturers and the experts say this. We still find that there are doctors out there that are pushing the weight loss agenda because there is a financial reward at the end of it. In the UK, like, there was literally, I don't know how many, I think it was £50 per patient that was referred. I don't know if the scheme is still going on, but there was definitely a scheme going on for at least 1 year. I believe it was 2, where you just got paid to refer people to a weight loss. And so doctors were doing that. They wanted to make the most amount of money in the quickest space of time. So they were sending out text messages. Can you imagine if you have a history of an eating disorder and you get a blanket text message from your doctor saying, would you like to be referred for weight loss? Respond yes, and we'll send you a link. I mean, it was crazy, but that was how they were making money. And so I think that is where the problem lies. And it's going to be worse and worse and worse. The UK just announced yesterday that they were going to be giving weight loss injections to unemployed fat people. If you're unemployed and quote unquote obese, you will now have the opportunity to have a weight loss injection. And people were really upset. They were like, why is this happening? Da, da, da. And I was like, did you not read who's running it? It's being run by Eli Lilly, the drug company who, along with Novo Nordisk, are set to make billions and billions of dollars by selling this weight loss drug. Of course they're going to pull stunts like that. And the medical profession is eating it up. We are gorging ourselves because there's money to be made here. I think that's always the problem. Ultimately, I could have said a lot of things, but Reagan does have a saying as well, follow the money. You just got to follow the money. If you follow the money, you will always find the answer. So that, I think, is particularly problematic. And it's only set to get worse. It's really hard then, as a doctor, like you said, the lone voice who's going, well, no, this isn't fair, this isn't right. Well, yeah, it's the right thing to do for our patients. It's not the right things to do necessarily to line our pockets. And that's why I left medicine, really, ultimately, because I didn't want to be forced into a position where in order to earn my salary, I had to do something that I wasn't prepared to do. And that was ultimately the biggest, the simplest and easiest choice for me. No, if that's the only way that I can earn money, then I have to find another way to earn money. But most of my colleagues aren't going to agree.
Of course.
Yeah. I feel like here in the US, the system is a little bit different in that drug manufacturers are no longer allowed to pay doctors for prescribing. Am I mistaken in that? Is it a different system in the UK, or?
So it's a much stricter system in the UK. Eli Lilly has done a deal with the government. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. They have obviously, there is something going on in the works. That's interesting to find out. So Novo Nordisk has actually been banned by the British pharmaceutical kind of organization because of the fact that they were producing all of these courses, online courses that you could do on quote unquote weight management, and they were not disclosing that they were funding it, which is actually against the law in the UK. It's not against the law in the US, and they've been doing it for a very long time. Doctors don't get paid directly to prescribe weight loss. That doesn't happen. In the UK, there was a nationalized incentive, but that was from the government. That was not from the drug companies themselves. The government was incentivizing doctors in the UK to prescribe weight loss. So you'll find there are very similar things going on in the US. The only thing that makes the US quite unique at the moment is that alongside the pharmaceutical industrial complex, you also have this equally large and evil industrial complex, which is the medical insurance industrial complex. It doesn't exist in the UK because we have a free healthcare. And so these two giants who have a very long history of being unethical and not to be trusted, these two giants are currently fighting each other because the insurance company doesn't want to pay for these drugs and the pharmaceutical companies want the insurance companies to pay for these drugs. So they're actually pitted against each other at the moment. This is very interesting to watch how this is playing out. So a lot of people in the US can't get weight loss drugs because their insurance companies won't fund them. And in order for the weight loss drug companies to make their money, they need to force the insurance companies to pay out. So it's an interesting time to be alive. And it's interesting watching this all play out. But yeah, ultimately, doctors do get a ton of money for prescribing weight loss. It's just done indirectly. It's done through going to conferences or, drug companies find a way. And if you don't really know what I'm talking about, the best thing to do is to go and either read the book or watch the TV programs that surround the OxyContin debacle, right? You just have to go and see what happened 20 years ago. It's still happening today, just with weight loss. So Novo Nordisk really genuinely have taken the Purdue playbook and have just read through it and have copied it line for line. They have done exactly the same things. They are very clever about how they're doing it. But, these weight loss injections in particular, because they keep coming up, so I talk about them a lot, is if you're in recovery from an eating disorder, I can imagine what it must be like to hear about these drugs all the time, to hear even just people joking about it, Ozempic face, and isn't it amazing how much weight this celebrity has lost because they're on Ozempic? I mean, it's mind-boggling, but I just need people to understand Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are paying millions for all of this. It is all being paid for by drug companies. But yes, you're right. drug companies can't pay doctors directly, but they're very smart. They find other ways. Believe me.
Yeah. And I mean, I think anywhere in the world, it's the lobbies also, right? That will
Of
pay
course.
good money to maintain. I mean, we can talk about many different issues. And in the US, you really see that with weapons, for example,
Yes.
right? Where you're like, come on, we can't send our kids to school safe, but still it's okay to just buy, any weapon you want. So that's again something that I think Reagan talked about really, really well, in the sense of also how the BMI was changed to make sure that, you would get a bigger market. I agree with you. It's really a money issue. And I'm glad you could say that too, because I think it's something people need to understand.
So, changing the subject just a little bit. So, there's a lot of fear and fear mongering around health outcomes like diabetes, heart issues, and their relationship to body size. That's a lot of what we see is people changing diet or exercise because of fear of those outcomes. So, what kinds of things do you recommend to your patients who, say, come to you with an elevated A1C or elevated cholesterol, or things that they can do that are not focused on don't eat this and don't eat that and changing your weight? You talk about that with your patients.
The first thing I tell patients is that I can really demonstrate with very good evidence, a good evidence base, that weight loss is not going to prevent diabetes. It's not going to prevent high cholesterol. I can show you the statistics. I will show you the studies that show that weight loss is not going to extend your life in any way, does not improve mortality or anything. Weight loss is completely and utterly ineffective. In fact, if you look really close enough, you'll find that it actually does the opposite, causes more harm than good. So I make it very clear that weight loss is not, it's not going to benefit you. It is probably going to harm you. It could potentially cause significant harm, like not just a few side effects. I'm talking like long-term damage to your body. So I don't ever recommend weight loss. And I mean, there is no exception to this rule. I don't recommend it. That is not to say that I think you shouldn't do it. And I think it's very important for people to understand that as a doctor, my job is simply to inform and possibly to recommend. It doesn't go beyond that. I will always respect your autonomy. I will always respect your choice. I will never say anything to you. If you say, this is what I want to do, doc, I'm like, I'm here for it. I'm 100% behind you. I support you. It's your choice. I just want it to be an informed choice. So, for example, when people come in and say, I have an elevated A1C, well, either it's elevated enough for you to have diabetes or it's not. So this idea of pre-diabetes, I could spend an hour talking about that. This is a made-up PR campaign, genuinely. It was a PR campaign. It was started by the American Diabetic Association in 2001. They wanted to change the name from impaired fasting glucose, which sounds a bit lame, to pre-diabetes, which sounds like if you have it, you're going to get diabetes. Of course, the reality is that you're not going to get diabetes just because you have pre-diabetes. It's a made-up condition. Vast majority of people do not go on to develop diabetes who have pre-diabetes. And if you do, it's going to happen really quick. Either it happens or it doesn't happen. So I do a lot of education. Oh, pre-diabetes, that's not a thing. And if they say I've got a fatty liver, I go, oh, so what? I've got a fatty belly. It's all good. It doesn't matter. It means nothing. Just having a fatty liver is just like saying, well, I've noticed that your eyes are blue. Oh, congratulations. If you have a damaged liver, that's different. We'll have a conversation. But just a fatty liver? We started fat shaming livers in order to sell weight loss. There is no reason to talk about people's fatty livers unless they are at high risk of developing liver failure or liver problems. So if someone comes in to see and says, oh, I've got high cholesterol, the first thing I'll say, well, don't go on a diet because that will increase your cholesterol. Like we've shown over and over again that dieting increases LDL cholesterol. So just don't do that. So we have these conversations where I sort of just share the facts and I go, here's the data. Sometimes I show them a pretty graph or two just to reassure them that it's fine. And then I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a dietitian, I'm not an exercise specialist. So I don't go too much into it. But what I strongly recommend to people is to say, look, your body is smarter than the best computer out there. Your body has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. During that time, our species survived because we knew how to eat and drink, right? Like that was the whole point. We learned it a very long time ago. There are biofeedback mechanisms going on inside your body, that a complex combination of your brain and nervous system, your hormones, your gastrointestinal system, all working together in this really magical way that we don't understand, to tell you when you're hungry and to tell you when you're full. And the problem is you were able to do that for the first 6 months to 1 year of your life. And then someone came along and went, no, we know better. And we stopped. We ignored those biofeedback mechanisms. And for a really long time, we've been eating on prescription rather than eating what we need to eat and what we want to eat. And that is causing a lot of problems for a lot of people. So my only advice to people is listen to your body and where possible, learn to eat intuitively. Mm-hmm. And then I go, and now I suggest you go and see this weight inclusive dietitian, because that's at the point where I'm like, I don't know any more than that. I just know enough about the body to know that it's so smart. And the more you interfere, the worse it gets. And I often give people two kind of analogies for this. The first is we can all learn to hold our breath underwater. We can practice. We can get really good at holding our breath underwater. Some people can hold their breath underwater for minutes. Mm-hmm. And you can learn how to do that. But there will come a point in time, it doesn't matter who you are, when the need for oxygen will force you to the surface of the water. And unless you're tied down with weights, you're going to go to the top. You're going to rise back up again. And it's the same with going to the toilet, right? If you need to go for a wee, I learned when I was a doctor that there wasn't time for comfort breaks during ward rounds and busy wards. So I would go in the morning before work, before my first shift started, and I would go after my shift ended. So sometimes it was a good 8 hours, and I did not stop in between. I trained my bladder. Now, that was not healthy. Okay, it was not good for my bladder. Put me at risk of kidney stones. I wasn't drinking enough water. It was terrible. It was a bad idea. However, I trained my body to do that. And we can train our bodies to stop being hungry to a point. But after that point, it's literally the equivalent of putting weights around our ankles and throwing ourselves underwater. We're killing ourselves. Literally, we are destroying our bodies. And we really can't or shouldn't do that. So my advice is always if almost everyone is you're probably not eating enough. You probably need to eat more. That's usually my advice when I see someone. It's very rare that I'm like, maybe you need to eat less. Most of the time I'm like, I don't think you're eating enough. Have you considered eating more? And they're always really shocked by that. But then I'll send them to a dietitian who actually knows what they're talking about.
Nice. I think that some of the diets in particular, like the people who started intermittent fasting or one meal a day, and just how difficult it is for our bodies to deal with that kind of restriction. So even if overall you're eating enough, the restricted time window can really wreak havoc on our systems. And I really like your analogy of train our bodies, but only to a certain point.
Yeah.